¿Qué pasa, Pirila? Aquí Muchamiel. El vídeo que os traigo hoy es la comparación entre el WoW de 2004, el primero, el primigenio, el de verdad, con el Classic que tenemos ahora. ¿Cuánto ha cambiado y cómo ha cambiado esta situación? El vídeo es de Will y os lo dejo bajo en la descripción y básicamente este vídeo no lo puedo hacer yo porque yo en 2004 no jugaba. Yo empecé a jugar a principios de la WTLK, de la primera WTLK que hubo. Entonces en 2004 yo era muy chiquitín. Yo tenía 8 años, así que yo no sé esa situación. Así que me toca verlo porque yo no lo sabía. Os dejo el enlace del vídeo para que lo podáis ver y que los podéis suscribir. Vamos para allá. 10 ways our Classic is totally different from 2004 Vanilla. No lo voy a decir los números en inglés. Los números se dicen en español, de toda la vida. Empezamos.
In 2024, Vanilla World of Warcraft turned 20 years old, making it one of the longest standing and most successful MMORPGs ever. Over literal decades, millions of people have walked the lands of Azeroth. They've picked their class, grinded levels, and achieved great things within the game. Even today with Era and Anniversary Realms, Vanilla still remains popular, and seasonal servers have...
¿Sabéis qué es una de las cosas que lo hace tan bonito al WoW con respecto a otros juegos de este mismo estilo de MMORPG y tal? Fíjate toda la gente que hay aquí. Ninguno va vestido ni siquiera parecido a otra persona. No pueden ser más diferentes entre ellos. Ni siquiera paladines, ni siquiera... Bueno, estos dos van con el mismo set más o menos porque es de PvP. Pero los demás no van ni parecidos, porque cada objeto tiene una skin. No es como otros juegos, que van todos con el mismo, que es skin 1 o skin 2. Esto es una de las claves.
shown us that there is an appetite for changes to the base game too. But when you compare how
Normal.
things were in 2004 to 5 to 2024 to 5, well, it's clear that we are in many ways playing the same game, but just in a completely different and alien way to how it would have been. Many things we know to be part of the vanilla experience just didn't exist back in the day, and are often a product of us having 20 years of game knowledge and min-maxing at our backs. In some ways, it is still vanilla, in others it's kind of just its own thing at the same time, and I thought it might be interesting to go over 10 ways that vanilla is drastically different nowadays compared to how it was in 2004 and 5. So
aquí la diferencia que tenemos es que previamente en 2004 la gente jugaba, disfrutaba y ya está, y no había un main max, aunque sí que había tryhards por supuesto, pero ahora sí que lo hay. ¿Por qué? Porque es el mismo juego, pero un montón de años después, cuando ya lo sabes entre comillas todo. Por lo tanto es tan importante esto y eso es una de las más diferencias. Antes hacerte un molten core te costaba horas, te costaba días de preparación, muerte, había un montón de movidas porque no sabías exactamente qué hacer, ni qué cosas era mejor llevarlas, ni siquiera igual la flor de Frondaville o cosas así, ni siquiera se sabía cómo poder hacerlo. Ahora ya todo eso está tan masticado que obviamente cambia un montón y molten core se hace en 20 minutos.
Let's talk about what 10 things are the most different with today's modern metagaming. In the familiar, yet very different, there is one thing that's become more or less impossible to recreate from back in the day, and that's just how the game worked, both from Blizzard's end and from players. Remember in 2019 Classic, Blizzard reintroduced something called spell batching to the game, and players rejoiced that we were going to be getting the authentic vanilla experience. What spell batching meant in practice though is that spells would be dealt with in batches by the server, and those batches would take place every 400 milliseconds, meaning everyone had a forced 400 ping while they were playing vanilla. It almost sounded as though it could be a good idea for a moment. We were going to be getting interactions back which existed back in vanilla, like two mages being able to polymorph one another. In practice, this felt absolutely terrible to play with. You could press execute on an enemy, it spends your rage, the enemy dies, the batch window happens, your damage should have happened, but you deal no damage.
Son los tipos de cosas que yo no estoy de acuerdo con respecto a hacer un vanilla, un classic igual. A lo que me refiero es, tío, ¿por qué cometerías el mismo error dos veces? Puedes dejar el core, puedes dejar casi todo como toca, pero si sabes que algo hiciste mal, cuando lo hagas en el Classic, arréglalo. Obviamente no todo está mal hecho, ni muchísimo menos, pero cuando sepas que algo estuvo pésimo, que hubo que cambiarlo porque no era funcional, no repitas tu error 2 veces. En eso consiste la historia, en no repetir el error 2 veces.
Multiple paladins could cast Blessing of Protection on the same person at the same time. They'd even get multiple forbearance debuffs. They ended up getting rid of this towards the end of Classic, but I don't think it was the best thing to revisit. Internet was different back in the day too, with some of us just moving up from dial-up to a more dedicated line. Vanilla also ran on just about any system, which is one of the reasons why it did so well, which is something modern MMOs seem to be forgetting as they push for ever more realistic graphics instead of something more stylized and unique to their game. On top of that, there were very few loading screens in WoW.
Y obviamente se veía mucho mejor el WoW Classic 2019 que el de 2004 por cosas completamente lógicas y obvias.
On some other MMOs at the time, you get a loading screen for every zone you walked into. Vanilla was so smooth and seamless in comparison. Though if your system was poor enough, you could get stuck on a boat loop forever between, say, Booty Bay and Ratchet, because your PC wouldn't load the new zone before the boat had left again. One thing we have in common with 2004 and today is that WoW still absolutely cannot handle hundreds of people on the same screen at one time. Events such as Terra Mill vs South Shore on Classic, the opening of BWL when there was thousands of people in Black Rock Mountain, or the opening of the gates of AQ40 really did give us that authentic vanilla experience again, where the game just stops working once enough people get into a zone. If I had to guess why things are still like this, well, events of this type are so rare and would require so much bandwidth to accommodate that Blizzard just don't invest into improving performance here, and instead design around this volume of players being together, simply not happening. Either way, even with a super old setup by today's standards, vanilla runs well on just about anything, and very common internet issues are a thing of the past. Well, assuming you aren't too rural, that is.
El tiempo este antiguo de que el internet iba completamente mal, te llamaban y se te caía el internet, cosas así, ya obviamente ya no pasa, pero joder, no deja de...
Big difference other than our hardware and internet is how evolved add-ons and the UI has become.
Bueno, y los add-ons flipas.
It's interesting now how we're going through a bit of an add-on revolt at the moment, with people standing up to say add-ons have ruined the game or gone too far. Over on retail now, they're adding in stuff like damage over time trackers or cooldown trackers into the game, as well as the one-button rotation, of course. This is all to get WoW on console, by the way, which will be a thing eventually. And over the years, Blizzard have had to remove or limit certain add-ons, and have even admitted that much of modern boss design had to take into account the power of add-ons that players are able to make. But add-ons, and macros to a lesser extent in WoW, have always been a very important part of the game, and I know that my two favourite MMOs in RuneScape and WoW both support add-ons or plugins over on RuneScape heavily. You will have gotten thousands of hours of use out of add-ons where you've
es uno de los mayores cambios con mucha diferencia los add-ons.
They're kept up to date for free every single major patch. Where else in life do you get so much value out of something for free? If anything, we should be more thankful to people who are making and maintaining add-ons, and have more emphasis on Blizzard to say what is right or wrong in this space on a more regular basis. I mean, just now Blizzard are implementing UI features that have been basic to add-on packages since 2000.
Estos mismos add-ons han sido los que ahora mismo en retail tenemos ya incluidos. Todo este tipo de Elbu y hay un millón de cosas que ya el WoW te las da per se, más que nada porque no tenía ningún sentido que no te las diesen. El juego ha ido evolucionando con la gente. Y en clásico obviamente esto no lo pones, pero ya con los add-ons te lo pones tú. Por eso también es uno de los puntos, yo creo que es el más diferencial de todos, junto con el Main Max.
2008 or earlier. It is better late than never, but still, WoW wouldn't be the game it is without add-ons. Add-ons let players solve their own issues whilst the developer gets on with the big game updates. It's a win-win in my opinion. The UI has undergone some changes too, with us now having the modern settings introduced in Dragonflight, and Cataclysm even now has the updated Dragonflight Auction House too. They could put this new Auction House in all versions of Classic as far as I'm concerned, and if you're using an Auction House add-on, you aren't allowed to disagree. Also, I don't know if you've ever seen, but for raiding at the start of WoW, instead of the raid frames we have today, you had to drag each group out individually onto your screen in order to see multiple of them at the same time. It was so scuffed. Even in 2019 Classic, with all the no changes attitude, Blizzard just put in the modern raid frames from Cata into the game on day one, and pretty much no one complained about it. I mean, the people who would have cared enough were too busy getting worked up over water textures. Anyways, add-ons, UIs, macros, it's always been a huge part of WoW, and the game would not be what it is today day without them. Next up, in vanilla, epic items were epic. This was kind of a knock-on effect from it taking everyone weeks, if not months, of time to hit level 60. You could easily have hundreds of hours within the game and never see an epic item, let alone imagining stepping from the raid. I think the zone I've got the most epics in ever is Teneris, actually. I know I've got 2 Warden stays from the Thistle Shrubs all the way to the south near the entrance to Ungoro, but during this leveling portion of the game, there are very few epics. There are some bosses that drop some in dungeons. You've got Dragon's Call from Aranicus, Blade of Eternal Darkness from Theradras, Ironfoe from Emperor, Fellstriker from Rend, and so on. But with how rare these items were, they felt almost mystical and ephemeral, and to behold someone in full epic gear was like seeing a living legend of Azeroth. Today,
¿y cuánto valían estos ítems en esa época? Porque el oro tampoco se conocía. Por ejemplo, cuando se lo John Helmet, vamos a poner ese casco que es el mejor prácticamente, ni sabías que se podía conseguir ese drop, ni que tenía que ser con herrería, ni que todos los sitios que decían falta, ni que... Todo ese tipo de cosas no se conocían, es increíble, es que ojalá volver otra vez, que salga el WoW de nuevo sin saber nada, por Dios.
Though it turns out that epics are, I mean, they're pretty easy to get, to be honest, and there are still very few epics during the leveling portion of the game, but if you know Classic, you know most epics kind of just aren't very good, actually, and often there are better rewards from quests, or just carry on leveling and you'll get something better towards 60. And then once you hit raids, sure, the items that drop and BIS items are hard to get, but plenty of purple items are thrown about. It's just similar to leveling, most of them are kind of bad. Biggest of all though is how many people have epics nowadays, where back in the day you'd see the old guy with a few epics or a bit of raid gear. Now you stroll through Stormwind and there's a guy in tier 1, there's a guy in tier 2, there's a Thunder Fury, there's another Thunder Fury, and so on. Epics, as it turns out, really aren't that difficult to get after all. In 2004 and 5, Blizzard released several PvP battlegrounds, including Warsongul, Charathi Basin, and of course Alterac Valley. Each of these was played in quite a different way compared to now, but none more so than AV. Also, did you know that cross-round battleground queues didn't exist until the...
Oh, lo que tiene que haber sido Alterac Valley en el pasado, Dios mío, de las cosas más bonitas del mundo, por Dios. Ahora la gente se hace Alterac Valley en 5 minutos, llegas, vas al boss, lo matas y ya está. Antes la peña se pegaría hasta el saber cuándo, loco. Había que pedir días libres en el curro para poder hacerte un Alterac Valley en condiciones. Era el Monopoly del WoW. Dios mío, qué cosa más bonita, coño.
Final patch of vanilla. Your PvP used to be versus people exclusively from the same realm as you, so you really had to queue up at peak time and hope it popped. You definitely got some more competition on the people from your own server doing this, and you also knew if there was that one guy queuing up with absolutely insane gear who was just dominating everyone, yeah, he's going to be in every single battleground you queue. On top of that, Battle Masters and Capitals and the holiday weekend event NPCs, they didn't used to exist either. If you wanted to go Warsun Gulch, you had to go to Ashenvale or Northern Barrens to queue up. This is why PvP battleground entrances are close to one another for both factions, because you'd still get some duels or well PvP whilst waiting for the actual queue to pop. Anyways, nothing was more different than Alterac Valley. On our 1.12 launch of Classic WoW in 2019, this place was nothing like how it used to be. On release, Alterac Valley was difficult to progress. It was meant to be a long, gradual push from one faction who would over time gather resources, take bases, and eventually win. The guard NPCs in the valley were a lot stronger than they are now, and there would be mines off the road that would make it super difficult to take side paths through the valley. There would also be enemies like Korak the Blood Rager who would spawn in the Field of Strife as a boss who could be taken down. There were other benefits too, such as gathering nodes spawning in AV, including Black Lotus if you were fast enough. AV could easily last about hours in a row, simply because getting through the choke points was really hard to do, and this was exacerbated of course by your average player being, well, pretty bad at the game, and often having other performance-related issues. Alterac Valley now is all about the efficiency, the grind, to get honor as fast as possible until you are capped, and then to log out again. People cheer nowadays when they get into an AV that lasts 6 minutes where they can run from one end to the other, engaging in no PvP. Massive difference in how AV works compared to back in the day, both from how the battleground itself works and the attitudes of players in the game being way more goal driven. Sometimes it's easy to know when an item is good. You get a drop with more of the same stats compared to what you have, that's an easy upgrade. But back in the day, especially early on in WoW, there was less theory crafting and less widespread knowledge of which items were BIS. The best example of this has to be the Edgemaster's handguards. As we now know in vanilla, you either roll human or orc for warrior, or have to spend thousands of gold on these, because with
tal cual, estos guantes tú ahora sabes que son los mejores, extremadamente necesarios para todo aquello que no sea humano. Hachas en caso de los orcos. Y ahora mismo valen un dineral. Y antes seguramente no valían nada porque tú veías esto y decías, ¿y esto qué coño es? Si no da ni fuerza, ni aguante, ni nada. ¿Qué diferencia, tío?
Without them, you're going to deal noticeably less damage versus boss-level enemies due to how glancing blows and hit chance is calculated to scale off a bonus weapon skill. But if you check comments from back in the day for this item on Wowhead, many of the people were lamenting having received such a bad epic item, with one guy saying, I bought these because they are 45G, smiley face. They are my first epic items, smiley face. I'm a hunter, by the way.
Te toca ahora y gozas.
That is a classic hunter moment if I've ever seen one. Still, even during vanilla, you can see comments that people had started to work out how good the weapon skill stat was, and in fact these gloves were one of, if not the best epic items in the game to receive. Also for casters back then, it seemed to make sense to stack a ton of intellect, as that's the primary caster stat. But intellect didn't do much for your damage output, it just allowed you to do the same amount of damage for longer before going Oftentimes nowadays, just putting on random items that have pure of shadow damage, for example, will be way better for increasing your damage than equipping something which just increase your intellect more. And that's before we get into things such as hit caps, particle resist, heartbeat resist, the crit cap, and so on. Vanilla looks very simple, but it's always been quite the puzzle to math out how to really get the most out of your character. And even to this...
Pero es que es obvio. Antes ni estaba bien el poder de hechizos, ni se sabía si el objeto tenía que llevar poder de las sombras, si poder de naturaleza, si lo que fuese. Iba simplemente intelecto y poco más. Y luego ya no hablemos de la resistencia. Es algo completamente lógico, tío.
Today, as we'll talk about later, people are still innovating new ways to play the game. Another feature that Blizzard put into the game were a series of buffs that will be given to players in a zone after a quest item was handed in.
Fue de
These
open.
buffs will be powerful effects included as a bit of an extra reward to recognize that a player had completed a certain task. Today, we know them as world buffs. Back in vanilla, they were much more rare due to the amount of raids that were actively being completed where these quest items would drop, and it would be a surprise and just something cool to see happen.
Lo veo en Discord por organizar.
What's going on, and you wonder what this buff you just got was. World buffs have changed over time though, from an extra reward into a feature that the entire raiding metagame has become shaped around. Nowadays, people plan in advance when buffs will drop on Discord. They get summoned around the world to collect them, and biggest of all, they can chronicle these buffs to store them for later use to ensure they can get to raids safely. Saying this, top-end guilds back in the day absolutely did start to use world buffs for raiding, especially on harder bosses, to gain that extra bit of power that they needed. In fact, back in the day, world buffs could still be used in raids at the start of TBC, and methods, world first legit, of Lady Vash and SSC, was obtained using world buffs. It's just in Classic with so many years of experience compounded down, these buffs have become a normal part of raiding, but once they were just a bit of extra fun, and the idea by today's standards that even your random pugs are going to be gathering world buffs would be completely alien to players back then.
Ahora es algo completamente normal, tío. Si antes no sabías ni de dónde salían esos bufos, ni cómo salían, ni los podías almacenar porque no había Chrono Boom ni nada de eso, pues obviamente pues algunos irían a las mazmorras y a las raids pues con lo que llevabas puesto. Y luego si te matan los pierdes y era lógico morir a CD. Entonces pues joder, es normal. Y ahora es el pan de cada día. O los llevas o no vas.
Speaking of raid pugs, well, back in the day there really wasn't that many of them, if at all. You pug a bit of Molten Core, you'd have some ZG, some AQ20, and that would tend to be about it. Raiding as an endgame activity was for the few. Those players who had grinded all the way to 60, had farmed enough gold to raid, had collected a bunch of items in advance, and had a PC that was capable of raiding without crashing. And back then there were no streams of raids, there were very few YouTube videos and very few guides or Abyssalists. Raiding really was what it was to your guild and the people within your guild, and the top level guilds didn't share any information with one another.
Y lo bonito que tiene que haber sido en 2004 pillar a 40 personas e ir a un sitio donde no sabes qué coño va a pasar. Lo bonito que tuvo que ser el primer pililón que entró en Molten Core y dijo, ¿y esto qué coño es? ¿Y por qué estos bichos me han matado de un golpe? Vamos a ir 10, van 10, se mueren en el primeros bichos, hace falta más gente, van hasta 40. Qué bonito tuvo que haber sido eso, Dios mío, ojalá poder vivirlo, pero ya no, ya es imposible, ya no se puede hacer eso, pero ojalá haber podido vivir eso en 2004.
Another when it came to progression. In fact, the moment when they got to breaking silence was hitting a wall on a Bugs Cthulhu fight, which at the time was deemed mathematically impossible. Few people would see Ragnaros for real, never mind Nefarian or Cthulhu, and Kel'Thuzad in Max Ramus was a boss that's a rumored less than 0.1% of the player base.
Dame 20 minutitos.
¿20 minutos?
No, dame 10-12, que acabé de grabar. Sabes, a empezar.
Soon, and Kel'Thuzad in Max Ramus was a boss that a rumored less than 0.1% of the player base ever saw. It's no wonder in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard said, hey, we've got this whole undead-themed raid that pretty much no one's ever saw, let's just use that again and make it easy, shall we?
Claro.
Because everyone wanted to see the raids, everyone wanted to get the gear from the raids, but barely...
Ahora mismo para mí Ramas en la WTLK es lo peor que le pasó. ¿Por qué? Porque era una raid extremadamente sencilla, que tú lo haces en 25 con Giris y cae pero súper rápido, sin Discord, sin nada, es súper sencillo. Pero claro, En el primer Classic, en 2004, narramos así que prácticamente no se vio quién jugaba eso, quién podía llegar a ese nivel de lo más vasto. Un par de grupos solo, no habría demasiada gente. Entonces dijeron, joder, con lo guapa que están las ramas, porque es verdad que está guapa, joder, tío, vamos a poner la UTLK para poder usar otra vez esto, porque, coño, no hemos hecho nada. Pero sí que es verdad que a la UTLK le falta mucho más dificultad porque es muy fácil.
Anyone had the connections to get into a raid, the skills, or of course, most importantly, the time it would take to raid. By today's standards, I mean, let's remember the world first clear of Molten Core in 2019 Classic that took place 6 days post-launch, with just under half the
días
raid
después.
being level 16. It turned out that all the hyping up that vanilla is tough was but a memory of a different time that few people had been carrying on for many years. Nowadays, so many people raid. If we look at the number of passes logged for the last 2 weeks of Classic before we went on to TBC, there were 1.9 million passes logged from Warriors alone. If we divide that by 15 for each of the bosses of Nax Remus and then by 40, that will be enough Warriors alone to fill over 3,000 40-player raids. Man, just look at some of these other passes down here. Under 25k for Balanced Druid and Ret Paladin, compared to 1.9 mil for Warrior. That's like saying for every 1 Balanced Druid or Ret Paladin player, there were enough Warriors to fill nearly 2 40-player raids. Now that is some classic class balancing for you. Overall, so many more people raid now and it's so much more accessible. Another massive...
Es una cosa que antes no pasaba. Tú te creas un personaje y lo jugabas como podías. ¿Te gustaba el druida? Pues druida. Ya había más o menos una igualdad. Ahora sabes que el guerrero es el primero.
The difference between then and now is something which everyone has to do in the game, and that is the leveling journey. During actual vanilla, the amount of information available online was, let's just say, quite a bit more limited than what we have now. Sure, there were resources such as Thoughtbot, and people were putting together text leveling guides, but compared to what we have now, well, it's not comparable. Leveling would, without exaggeration, take people months to get through. Just to put it in perspective, baseline in the game, if we were to take your add-ons away, you can't see where quest NPCs are on the map, there are no exclamation marks or question marks on the map either, and you can't see where the mobs you need to kill are located either, so you'd have to just read each quest text you got and plan where you needed to go in the world. Oh, and on top of that, until you had explored a zone, the map was entirely blank, and there are no dungeon maps either, so in other words, good luck finding your way around. Can you imagine playing this game today as a totally new player, using no guides and no add-ons, and seeing how long it would take you to hit 60? People would take so long leveling because that's kind of just how the game is built, but at the time, World of Warcraft was so revolutionary that people wanted to keep going. They wanted to hit that next level for the new talent point or ability, or get over the next hill to see what the new zone was, to find a new dungeon perhaps. It was so hype. The world was massive and we knew practically nothing, and those two things together made for a truly magical time. So compared to now where people are hitting level cap in under a week, self-boosting themselves as a mage, or even getting boosted would have been crazy. Speaking of boosting, this is another area of the game that is most different. Now the idea of boosting isn't new. People have been running friends through lower level content or helping others level since the dawn of the MMO, but the scale and knowledge around boosting now is absolutely crazy. If you showed a vanilla player from back in the day a mage pulling 500 mobs in Maradon, kiting them perfectly and hopping between safe spots to AoE them down, they would think you're hacking or something. Imagine one singular player defeating 500 enemies at the same time. But now in vanilla, hey, it's just a service you can go and buy. People are selling it all day every day. Mages can also boost themselves to level in the likes of Zul'Farrak by hopping between some pillars where the graveyards are, and even now in Lower Blackrock Spire, there's been some new mage tech emerging, allowing them to boost here too. It turns out when you have a class that can apply amazing slows to an infinite amount of mobs with zero diminishing returns on their damage, they can do some truly crazy things. Back in the day it would have been small scale boosting as decent gold farms or to help friends. Nowadays it's like factories pumping out max level characters to get into raids. A big difference for sure. Last thing I have, and the most mind-blowing difference from then to now, is about boss kill times. And what's going on here is even quite new for anniversary realms. So we all know the memes about classic bosses being easy, right? 1 minute boss fights and all that. Well, by today's standards, that a 1 minute boss fight for the top level guilds would be incredibly slow. Ever pushing boundaries, people have started min-maxing in entirely new ways to push boss kill times into the unthinkable. Currently, the world record speed kill, for example, on Baron Geddon is 9 seconds. 18 seconds. Veilstraz and Blackwing Lair, also 9 seconds. Nefarian, 30 seconds. Now, as you'd imagine, these kill times involve your DPS basically just being warrior. In fact, on average, guilds which are doing these speed kills are packing somewhere around 25 warriors. Other classes are needed, though, to support the warriors and make them do more damage. There are armor debuff classes such as Druid with Fairy Fire, Rogue with Expose, and Locke with Curse of Wrack. You also have a Hunter to pull stuff so enemies can get to the warriors faster, Paladins for Blessing on Alliance, and Shamans for Wind Fury on the Horde. People are running 3 to 4 healers in a 40-man raid, remember, and of course the tanks are also warriors, obviously. But where things are different nowadays is making use of certain buffs, including the
el mejor DPS es el mismo que juega como tanque, que todos son lo mismo, que pegan una puta barbaridad. Y antes era por lo que había y hasta 9 segundos un boss, tío, qué locura. Tarda más en matar un haz.
Battle Squawk buff from the Gnomish Battle Chicken. This can proc when in combat and gives you a 5% melee haste buff. This buff will activate on everyone in your party and will stack on multiple buffs, so you can have 5 of them at the same time. This tactic of using Battle Chicken was very meta in TBC, but Blizzard did fix it towards the end of the expansion, so it didn't work anymore. However, in Anniversary, it seems as though people have figured out a way to get them to proc consistently again. On Anniversary, there's also no more buff or debuff cap, meaning there's no longer a concern about stacking too many buffs on one player and going over the cap of 32, or using too many debuffs on the boss. And perhaps the biggest difference compared to how speedruns used to be is that warriors are now running a rec set. So when you use recklessness and world buffs, you are already over 100% crit chance. So any crit or agility on your gear has no value. Assuming you're a warrior, that is, warriors don't get attack power from agility. This means that people want to stack as much raw attack power or strength as possible on their gear to max out their attack power stat. So people are now equipping BOE greens that give pure strength over actual raid gear here to min-max. And since these raids have some 25 warriors in near to bis with specialized gear, it makes boss fight durations so short that they can gear in this unique way, since recklessness has a 15-second duration. So in short, have many warriors with cooldowns up, gear for maximum strength, press all your cooldowns, and the boss dies before any of your cooldowns like Death Wish or Recklessness are running out. And that's how nowadays people are defeating raid bosses in under 10 seconds. Again, if you showed this to somebody from back in the day, they would think you are cheating somehow. But hey, this is how some people like playing the game, and who knows how short fight durations will get, so more power to them. And those have to be...
Tampoco es que haya personas que les guste jugar así, sino que la sociedad cambia, la vida cambia, el juego cambia y te obligan a jugar así, porque no vas a poder jugar en ciertos sitios o ciertas mazmorras donde, hermandades, donde los bosses caigan en 4 o 5 minutos pudiendo caer en 10 segundos. Es lo que hay, tío, la vida te fuerza a esto. Si te gusta, juegas con nosotros, si no, no.
Be 10 of the biggest differences in vanilla WoW between then and now. There's definitely more to it than just this, of course, but those are a few things that I thought it would be interesting to talk about. Like I said at the start, it is a familiar world in vanilla, but the ways we play the game today are so incredibly different, and these were really just some of the examples of the more extreme changes that have happened.
Por supuestísimo, el juego ha cambiado muchísimo, pero ya os digo, simplemente mirad aquí cómo lleva unos pantalones rojos, una pechera roja con hombreras de coco verdes, aquí lleva esta de aquí, las sombreras estas con el pañuelo, este ya con el set, el arma, es todo completamente distinto. Eso es lo que diferencia al WoW de otros juegos, sobre todo. Pero sí cambió un montón el saber las cosas que habían, ahora que se sabe completamente todo. Y de verdad, ojalá pudiésemos volver a 2004, al WoW de antaño, sin saber nada de lo que hay ahora. No podría ser más feliz, pero lamentablemente eso no puede pasar. Muchas gracias por el vídeo, espero que te haya gustado. Si es así, dale like y suscríbete si te gusta, no lo hagas. Recuerda que abajo en la descripción tienes todos mis links, todos los días en Twitch, pues mira a verlo. También está el vídeo de Willy. Muchas gracias por el vídeo y ahora sí, corten, por favor, corten.